when there's a vacuum and you cannot fill it with concepts like settler colonialism that would explain very clearly what's happening, then what does it get filled with? So the way I'll get into this is to talk a little bit about some research that I did, which I ended up publishing as a series for Weave News called The Deepest Fake News. And what I was trying to do there was to understand um, how settler colonial situations, I'm most interested in Palestine, but I also looked at North America and Australia as other cases, how those situations are covered, right? When there is conflict, when there is indigenous resistance, when there are movements happening that sort of bubble up into the news. Okay, so it is covered, but how is it covered? What's there? What's missing? All right, and so what I focused on was the concept of settler colonialism itself, which is obviously a concept that is has inherent truth value for any indigenous person, for any colonized person. Um, and yet, that concept, which has tremendous explanatory value, right, is essentially absent from establishment media coverage in the United States. I looked at CNN, I looked at NPR, I looked at the New York Times, in relationship to a number of these cases. So, as a way of getting into this, I drew on an insight from a sociologist named Mark Ayesh, who I'd interviewed for the Weave News podcast. And Mark talked about how when Palestinians appear in the news, and they do often, right? I mean, Palestine is heavily covered in many ways. When they appear, at best, they're sometimes given the opportunity to say, "This is what has happened to me. My home was destroyed.
At
My
best.
father was arrested." At best, right? So the way that Mark explained it, which I thought was just really insightful, was that they're given the opportunity to say, A, B, and C happened to me. But if given the chance, they would also explain very clearly why,
Mm.
right? The why, the context. Okay, it's because there is a colonial project that is an ongoing project. It's because there's a belligerent military occupation in my homeland. It's because of the U.S.-Israeli alliance. It's because of et cetera, et cetera. And it's that context that is often just sort of inadmissible from establishment media coverage. So we can think about this as a kind of explanatory vacuum. It's like there are events happening, people are hurting, there's violence and so forth, but there's an explanatory vacuum. And when there's a vacuum and you cannot fill it with concepts like settler colonialism that would explain very clearly what's happening, then what does it get filled with? It gets filled with ideas that are sort of default ideas given to us by the dominant ideology, right? And that is a tremendously impoverished form of coverage.
Well, and an example of that kind of dominant narrative is that I strongly agree with your categorization of that when Palestinians are part of the coverage of the from legacy news outlets, um, they might at best get to talk about some of the things happening, but usually they don't get a chance to do that until after they take some kind of weird loyalty oath. Almost invariably, some news anchor, caster, what have you, that can't always dignify those people with a label of journalist, but they usually ask some question about if they denounce Hamas, or
Mhm.
if they denounce anti-Semitism, as if these people don't like understand the broad definition of Semite, or right. It's a bizarre, it's almost like a ritual in the Western press that if somebody's on and they get a chance to talk about the extraordinary degradation and destruction that's happening in their lives, they have to first pay fealty to the West, before they're allowed to maybe get a chance to say at best, John Collier.
Yeah. Yeah, and that's been a pattern for a long time. And I will say that under the horrific conditions that we've been seeing in Gaza since Israel launched its genocidal assault, one of the things that's come out of that is a tremendous effort by many, many people, beginning with Palestinians themselves on the ground, and the courageous journalists who've been targeted, of course, for their work, right? But who are on the ground and trying to get the word out, and essentially forcing media outlets to pay attention, to say this is happening. It's the images are right there. You must acknowledge this, right? And so there has been, some inroads, right, into the coverage. And yet the kind of patterns that you're talking about are still there. I'll give you an example. Just the other day, I was listening to what in many ways was a good interview on NPR's Morning Edition with Diana Buttu, who's a fantastic Palestinian lawyer. And she was, responding to questions from the host, and she referenced the fact that there is an ongoing genocide happening in Gaza. And you could tell that the host immediately was like almost interrupting her just to say, okay, yes, Amnesty International has said this and so forth, but the Israeli government has denied that,
Both
so
sides.
thinking about liability rather than thinking about, what is actually happening. And so those patterns, they shift, they morph into other things, and they morph in part in response to courageous efforts to build other kinds of narratives, right? And we have to acknowledge those, right? It's not all bad news. It's that there's a lot of great work that's happening that is getting the attention of the establishment, and then the establishment responds in the ways that it does.